Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, CI501. I'm very excited to be working on Unit 4, Equitable Learning Outcomes with Technology. So I want to briefly review Units 1 through 3 as they inform Unit 4. So in Unit 1, we talked about learning theory, and we focused on new models for learning and teaching. So moving away from behaviorist and cognitivist understandings of how people learn to fully explore the complex dimensions of learning, especially social constructivism, which posits that learning is composed of active engagement with materials, with other people, with previous histories, and with new understandings. So moving away from thinking of learning as knowledge or strictly knowledge to think about learning as social participation and getting beyond the idea that learning is just a psychological phenomenon. So moving beyond the idea that learning is something that happens in the head to thinking of learning as a social activity. So all of those things will inform how we think about the kind of learning that happens through technology, as well as how we can design our learning experience to be equitable for all our learners. In Unit 3, we focused on new literacies, and Julie Coiro et al. Suggested that new literacies are essential to full civic, economic, and personal participation. I've also suggested that new literacies can facilitate new social acts, including supporting identity expression. So how can we design our learning spaces, both in the classroom as well as society at large, in order to not only give access to everyone, but to enable fair learning outcomes for everyone. So there are 4 readings for this week. You can choose 3. The Warsh Hour was focused on equity from both a national and a international perspective. He has a really good quotation that says, "Far from being a magic bullet, access to technology can actually increase existing inequalities, even if it's provided for free and with the best of intentions." So he talks about the idea of the social envelope and the importance of the technical and social support around the use of technologies. He gives the example of 1 laptop per child, which is a pretty typical ed tech intervention, similar to the way that iPads were introduced throughout the United States. And there are just major challenges that come when you develop, maintain, and evaluate the effectiveness of a large-scale technology integration program. He mentions that this kind of technology can even exacerbate these inequalities, and that students who have greater literacy skills will leverage these skills for their own learning. That's not to say that we cannot use technology equitably. So he suggests that if we use technology and it's accompanied by curricular reform, teacher PD, as well as infrastructure support, we can actually enable diverse learners to learn equitably. So it's more than just what happens in the classroom. Learning outcomes are, of course, influenced by student and parent socioeconomic status, as well as parental role, expertise, and the experience of the teacher, as well as the network effects. Article 2 is a manifesto for how we can conceptualize of technology. And this is by Baratunde Thurston. And so he says that this is a unique opportunity. This moment of deep distrust of big tech gives us an opportunity to rewrite the rules governing how the data we generate is collected, used, and valued. He makes 6 points These are actually similar to the recommendations that I want you guys to do for assignment 4. He says we need real transparency around how technology companies are using our data. The data default should be changed from open to close, so companies don't rob us, taking a data conservation approach. So data collection should be lean and constrained. We need to own our data. Tech companies need to diversify, including people who think differently, which is funny that he mentions that because that's a reference to Apple's campaign of the 1980s, think differently. We need to have new laws and regulations in the same way that the European Union recently passed GDPR, which is a data regulation law. And users need to control data so they can create civic projects that serve society. So in the same way that Cargo et al. Suggested that new literacies are central to full civic, economic, and personal participation in society, how our data is collected and used will also can also be a launch pad for participation in the larger society, rather than kind of commercial and exploitative. Next, we have the book chapter by Neil Selwyn, and this is a chapter from the book called Distrusting EdTech. And he says, digital technology is assumed to be one of the least problematic elements of contemporary education, while he encourages us to examine the social interest beyond EdTech. So typical questions that we ask involve an instrumental conception of technology. So how can we harness technology? What are effective EdTech practices? How does technology transform teaching and learning? So we need to go beyond just the individual classroom to focus on these social spheres, right? So EdTech happens in a context. It's not just our classroom. So we need to think of the inherently social nature of digital technologies and the shared political, economic, cultural, and historical nature of EdTech and its practices. We need to problematize the claims of fairness and efficiency brought about by technology. We can't just take them at face value. We have to interrogate the techno-solutionist ideas that come from Silicon Valley and which are kind of built into these EdTech products and processes. So EdTech is not a neutral force for good that can simply be applied or implemented out of the box. I really like this quotation by Andrew Feenberg, who wrote the Critical Theory of Technology in 1991, where the quote is from. It says, technology is not destiny, but a scene of struggle. Right, so technology is not destiny, but a scene of struggle, meaning that there's various social actors at play every time we use technology in our class. So we must double our commitment to issues of equity, empowerment, justice, and participatory democracy. Simply using EdTech is not enough to democratize or make our classrooms or our society or schools more fair. The third article is by Waters, Audrey Waters, who is one of the most prolific online writers. She gives numerous keynotes, and she maintains an active blog presence as well as social media presence. And one of the major points from this article is that she challenges the narrative that education is a civil rights issue of our time. No, civil rights is the civil rights issue of our time. I also love the quotation, there are things that the education gospel can't fix. So we have to go beyond the technology to incorporate where it's coming from, how it's being used, and actually how it can be discriminatory, how it can be exclusive, meaning how it can exclude people. Waters describes the kind of larger context and suggests that there are deep and lasting differences in tech access, usage, and opportunity to learn as a result of our deeply unfair US society. The future is here, it's not just evenly distributed. So many people still do not have access to broadband, still depend on their smartphones rather than access to computers, and have intermittent access to Wi-Fi and the internet. She mentions the digital Matthew effect. So through the use of technology, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And she references MOOCs. And so people who use MOOCs often, so the people who benefit most from MOOCs are not, so the benefits of MOOCs are not evenly distributed, and those who benefit most from MOOCs are kind of upper class white males rather than those who are the most marginalized. She references the Reich article, Reich et al., the state of wiki usage in K-12 schools. That's a great article, a great resource. I encourage you all to read it. He found that EdTech use in schools serving low SES students have fewer opportunities for 21st century skill development, and schools serving high SES students use wikis for creative collaborative purposes. So it's not enough just to drop technology into schools. We have to train teachers in how to use it effectively. This is especially important for students or for teachers who are working in low SES schools. She says, who gets to use computers for self-directed, creative, constructivist learning? She says the architecture of EdTech is not neutral. So I want us to focus on the idea that EdTech could actually make things worse because it teaches student compliance rather than learning. And she also mentions that EdTech does not magically flatten hierarchies, right? So we have to look at how it's used for what ends and who's excluded from meaningful, engaging, transformative practices. Thank you very much, and I encourage all of you to read the articles, all 4 if you can, and I look forward to assignment 4. I look forward to seeing your conversations. Thank you.